Welcome everybody. I'm here with a very special guest, Neeshee Pandit of Atma Astrology. We're going to be doing a series on Ayurveda and astrology, how to integrate Ayurvedic medicine and astrological techniques so that you can get a better sense of well-being for yourself. And if you are an astrologer, you can find ways to implement these things for your clients. Neeshee is an Ayurvedic practitioner, and he studied at the California College of Ayurveda. He's a Vedic astrologer who specializes in medical astrology. And he's also has an interest in Tibetan medicine, medical qigong, homeopathy. So he has a wealth of knowledge, and I recently met Neeshee at Ernst Wilhelm's place this past fall. And we had quite a few interesting discussions on astrology and Ayurveda. I thought it'd be wonderful to bring him on this channel. He's already been on here once. And our ultimate goal with this series of courses that we're going to be doing, classes on YouTube, will be leading up to an actual Ayurveda and Vedic astrology course. So stay tuned. We have about, I think, 6 to 7 videos we're going to be doing together to give an introduction to how all this fits together, what Ayurveda is, how it works with astrology. And then after that, we will be planning to do an intensive online webinar together. And that might be a 15 to 20 hour course, depending on how far we get along with it. So stay tuned for that. And you can also look at the information section at the bottom of this video to find the events page, which will give that the sign-up details once we have them. So welcome, Neeshee. It's wonderful to have you.
Thanks, Ryan, for having me.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Likewise.
Yeah, so today, we're going to be talking about Ayurveda, and as we discussed in the email and right before we got into this this recording, the idea of the 5 elements is key to where we want to go. So you being the expert in all these things, my question to you is, number one, for those people who don't already know, what is 5 element theory and how does it relate to Ayurveda?
Okay, so the 5 elements is really the foundation of both of these sciences, in my opinion, astrology and Ayurveda, but especially Ayurveda. And what are the 5 elements? The 5 elements are space, or sometimes called ether, air, fire, water, and earth. Mm-hmm. And they're always listed in that series for a very important reason, because each of the elements are described as arising from the previous. So space is the first element, the root element, from which all the other elements arise. It's like the context for manifestation. Then you have air, which is the original motion, the first activity, often described as wind even. That gives rise to fire, water, which is getting more dense, and then earth is the densest expression of elements. And the reason it's so important to understand the 5 elements is because they are a cosmological paradigm, in the sense that they actually describe the makeup of the universe, the origination of the universe, but also what the universe is. Mm-hmm. And fundamental principle of Ayurveda and astrology is that the macrocosm is in the microcosm and vice versa. So if we can understand our environment, our cosmic environment, our atmosphere, what we're actually arising in, then we understand our bodies. We understand what's actually happening in our own system. So that's the import of the 5 elements, is that we need to understand what we are and how that's functioning in us.
So when you're thinking about these 5 elements, you break them down, and if I recall correctly, you described how they get more dense. So right. you have this massive, I guess you can't say you have an amount of ether because there's nothing there. Right. But as it boils down to earth, earth then eventually, does it contain all of the elements? Essentially, is that how you think of it or not?
That's one way of looking at it. You could say, see, when you get to either end of the spectrum, it starts to become kind of comprehensive. Mm-hmm. So space contains everything because it gives rise to everything. Right. So you can say that. But you can also say that earth contains everything because everything preceded it to get to that point. So right. I'd say both are true.
Uh-huh. So when you're thinking, go ahead.
So, it's good to think of it as a spectrum. The five elements are a spectrum, and elements themselves are already on a spectrum, because if you consider like Taoist cosmology and Taoist philosophy and medicine, then you consider also some schools of Buddhist thought, they describe the universe as five pure lights. And then they say that the five pure lights, unrecognized by human beings or by beings, not seen as like the inherent luminosity of consciousness, are grasped objectively. And that objectification makes the light more dense. And so the arising of the elements is kind of a embodiment of what was originally simply radiance.
Okay.
So the elements are kind of on a spectrum in that sense. The elements are just energy, in other words.
Right.
But they are the energy that makes up the physical universe in our physical bodies. They are the constituents of everything.
Okay, so we do have a separate video scheduled to discuss how these elements specifically relate to astrology. So those of you who are interested in that, just hold on. We want to lay the foundation first. So when we're thinking about each of these elements, when we think about ether, when we think about fire, wind, water, earth, and so on, when it comes to Ayurveda, what role do they play in helping us understand how to live, how to stay in balance, as is the goal of Ayurveda?
That's a good question. And I think the key to understanding it is that the elements are a dynamic, right? They're not merely a static constituent. Okay, they're actually a process, because the universe is an active, dynamic expression. It's moving, it's changing, lots of things are happening. So they're also a cycle then. The five elements are a cycle.
Okay.
A generative cycle, a dissolving cycle. They're describing the process of existence, not just what existence is, but how it's happening. Right. So in that sense, you can apply the five elements to everything. And in Ayurveda, we're looking at elements in terms of seasons, foods, the body, organs, everything, systems, organ systems, tastes, everything is categorized within the paradigm of the five elements.
Right. So I know in Ernst Wilhelm's course, Ayurvedic Anatomy and Nutrition. Have you taken that course? Are you familiar with it?
I've taken that course.
Okay. So I know that he focuses a lot on the idea of five elements, but I think it's different than what we're going to be going into with Ayurveda. Is that correct? Or
there's significant overlap, but some of his focus is coming more from the Chinese perspective.
Okay. Because I know he focuses on looking at where is the imbalance, as you talked about, in the dynamic interplay of all of these elements. Right. Is this similar in Ayurveda too?
I would say that whole concept of that cycle, which I just hinted at, is not as prevalent in Ayurveda. It's not a foreign concept, but we basically look at that cycle in terms of the doshas, which is how that cycle crystallizes in the physiology.
Right.
But that's it. That's how we're going to hone in on it. We're not going to try to see an element in relationship to another element in that cyclical process.
Okay. So we're just waiting until it distills down from the elements to the pranas to the doshas, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, before we get into the idea of prana and doshas, maybe just very broadly, what are some key words about each element? And that way, when people are getting ready to really get into studying this material, when they're thinking about ether, when they're thinking about wind and fire and water, what are some qualities, what are ways people can think about these, some key words of each of these elements?
Okay, let's start with space. Space, I would say key words are context, foundation, ground.
That sounds very earthy.
Well, either extreme is going to be very similar.
Yeah. Right. But it's the field in which everything happens.
Field is a good word.
Okay. Well, is it also the, again, using the word field, is it also the field in which sort of it's the field in which everything else grows out of, right? Because then you start getting the other elements from that, correct?
That's right.
So is there a way to think about, these elements? So for example, ether or space, as you put it, is there a way to have it within our lives such that it promotes health, or is there a healthy version of space and ether? I know this might be taking it more down to the doshas or the idea of the doshas, but is there a thought about that?
Yeah, that's a good one. And ether or space is described as the element that's the closest to consciousness itself. Okay.
Okay.
Consciousness is, of course, like the substratum of everything. And that's the transcendental consciousness that I'm talking about now.
Okay.
So that's reality itself. Okay. Now, ether in that sense, space in that sense, is still a conditional element. It's not itself like the divine reality. So it's something like the cosmic womb, And that's why a lot of times you read Vedic cosmology, they talk about the universe as like being an egg, originally being an egg out of which everything is born. There's some real significance to some of those statements.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay.
So space in our life is our connection with, the fundamental essence of things, mm-hmm. which ultimately leads to spirituality.
So trying to see things as they are versus how we want to impose our mind. Is it in a sense sort of before the mind starts judging things?
Yeah, it is that. And it's also in the body, the connection with joy and bliss. Mm-hmm. Space right. manifests as a natural blissful quality, mm-hmm. prior to contents, prior to concepts, prior to all of the concreteness of existence. There's space. And there's like a bliss in that space. Like when we go to sleep, that's like an entry into space, basically. There's no concept.
There's nothing to become attached to cause the aversion or
exactly
the pain. Okay. All right. So going from space or ether, then what is the next element, and what are some keywords or thoughts or ideas that revolve around that element?
Okay. The next element is air. And air is very similar to space, that's why they group together. But air is not, space is static, it doesn't actually have mobility. Mm-hmm. So air is that mobile expression, the activity, the first activity, the stirring of space.
Okay.
The key words would be activity, motion, wind,
okay.
Movement.
Okay.
Movement, yeah.
And from that, if we start thinking about these, you've got the space in which, or field in which all things occur, and then there is the potential for movement. And would change fall into that as well, or is that more of like a fire? Okay. So the movement occurs, which when we have movement, eventually that creates friction, which right. gives rise to heat. And so then I'm assuming that fire or heat is the next element within this process.
That's right. So then fire is born.
Okay. And how do you, when we think about fire, many things can come to mind, but in this theory, what are the key words that you like to use for fire?
Fire is one of the most interesting elements. You can spend videos on talking about connotations of fire. Fire is transformation, but also light. I think those are the best words for it.
Okay. So transformation and light. How does that relate, though, when we think about, when we have the wind and the idea of movement, and it creates this kind of friction, and from that friction, then we start to get, this fire, this heat, and this light. So, I know we didn't necessarily want to get into this, and we don't even have it on our list yet. But when I think about the ideas of the gunas, and the idea of rajas as being transformation and change, is fire that thing which results from that constant changing, that constant churning of consciousness? Is it something that's supposed to bring light to what this consciousness is all about, or is it all of these things?
It's all of those things.
Okay.
So space is the context in which life arises. So it's like the root form of life. Air is the arising of life, or the initial flow.
Okay.
And fire is the fire of life, the first kind of more concrete manifestation, the illumination, the real expression.
The ability to experience, does that fall under the idea of fire? Because
yes, experience and see.
To see things, right.
Because fire also relates to sight and vision and perception. So you can see that that's why I think cosmology is an important way of looking at elements, because they are describing a kind of a process of things coming into being.
Mm-hmm.
So fire is that next stage in which, like, yeah, now there's a visual field. There's a manifestation. You know, light is what supplies that initial flow of air with a substance.
Right. And we often think about air and prana as intertwined. The wind and
Right.
prana is intertwined. Would it be too premature to kind of get into that idea now? Should we save that? Or when we think about the element of wind and air, is that speaking to the general idea that most people have of prana, or is this even a precursor to that?
Well, I think it's important that you bring that up, because this is a really key point, and this mistake is made a lot in Ayurveda and in all of these sciences where prana is discussed and elements are discussed, which is the notion that prana is restricted to one element.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Now, basically, all the 5 elements are describing prana and different aspects of prana. Wind is the most identifiable form of prana because of the movement, and prana is a flow. But we'll see prana is equally related to fire and light, and prana is equally related to water and its density, and earth and its concreteness. There's all kinds of ways to look at it. So, I think it's good, and this happens in Ayurveda when you start looking at subdoshas and people start thinking that prana is one of the subdoshas of vata. But that's not true, because vata itself is within the concept of prana.
Right. I see.
So,
okay. Right.
We'll have to flesh that out more later, but.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's good to stay on point here. So we've gone from space to wind and air to fire, and then next up, I'm assuming it's water.
It's water.
Okay.
That's right. And one thing I'm going to say before we go to water, one more point on what we just said, which is that in Sanskrit, there's often 2 words that are used, and I think they're useful to differentiate.
Well, wait a minute. Make sure you pronounce it perfectly, because someone on this channel will get on you about pronouncing it perfectly. And plus, you have an Indian background. You have an Indian ancestry, so you have no excuse for not pronouncing it perfectly.
All right, you got it. This one's easy.
Okay.
This one's easy. So wind or air is rightly described by the Sanskrit word vayu.
Okay.
Okay. And vayu makes up prana. So those are good distinctions to make.
So vayu makes up prana. So then, in reading about like the 5 vayus, is that the same thing as the 5 pranas, or am I getting something mixed up?
That is the right way to talk about it.
Okay. All right. Gotcha. All right. And why do you make that distinction, just out of curiosity?
I make that distinction so that people don't identify air element as prana itself.
Okay. So break it down just to belabor the point just a little bit longer. So if someone's going to be talking about the air element, what is the proper kind of terminology? And if they're talking about the idea of prana, what is the proper terminology to kind of keep that straight in our heads?
Well, I would say that talking about air element, the best word to use is vayu.
Okay, air element, vayu.
Air element is vayu.
Okay.
And prana is really a much larger concept in which even the elements are contained. It's the largest concept that we can really have here.
Okay. I guess it's probably hard to describe that large element. Anyway, okay. Well, let's go ahead. We'll get to that, I'm sure, eventually.
We'll have to do a video on just understanding prana.
I think that's a great idea. I think that's a wonderful idea. So let me make a note of that. And while I'm making a note of that, the idea of water and the water element, the keywords behind it.
Right. Water. Now, water has a lot of similarities with air, but here the difference is that what's flowing is liquid in nature, and what is indicated by liquid is density.
Okay.
So this is also a flow. Water is a flow, but it's a dense flow, whereas the flow of air has no density associated with it.
Okay. So there's no density with air, and we get to water, and now there's density to that flow.
Right. So water, therefore, represents nourishment.
Okay. Because it can transport things, or it is a thing itself?
Both. But also without that, without that flow of water, of course, a lot of things wouldn't get transported.
Right. Okay. So when people are thinking about the idea of water and this element, and the density of it, what are some other keywords or some other thoughts or ideas that they could tag to it? You said nourishment. That's a good one, right?
Nourishment, weight.
Weight. Okay.
Weight. And now we're getting into embodiment.
Okay. So these are things that I would typically, aside from flow, things I would typically think of related to, say, earth. So we're just seeing that there's just different levels of this kind of density, and earth is going to be the most dense of them all, correct?
Exactly. So space and air kind of go together.
Okay.
Fire stands on its own.
Okay.
In the middle of these two ends of the spectrum. And then water and earth go together.
Okay. So space and air, and then fire in the middle is sort of a phase change, I guess. And then you have water and earth following.
Exactly.
And it's the water and earth which gives the ability for the body itself to form, correct?
That's right.
Okay. And then with the earth, when we get into the earth element, are these more the idea of the concrete structures of life in our body, or how would we think?
Exactly. The concrete structure, but also earth is lacking in dynamism.
Okay.
So it's static. So this is similar now to, this is mirroring space and air. Okay. Space is static. You know, it has no mobility, but air is that expression of its mobility. Okay.
Right.
Similarly, earth on the other end of the spectrum is completely static. It has no motion in it. It's that most concretized element. And when things are taken to their greatest density, it's basically what we call matter. You know, I mean, it's like a desk, you know, it's hard and not moving and just a structure itself. But water is that aspect of it, which is flowing.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. So we could almost imagine like an inversion there where we have fire in the middle. And I find that really interesting, that fire is the one in the middle, and fire is the one of change, and fire is the one that gives light and the ability to see and the ability to perceive. So it kind of brings back the whole idea of a tapas, or that spiritual fire, which gives us, I don't know, maybe the sight of self-realization, if you want to call it that way. So it's almost making me think about things like, as understanding the elements kind of gives an insight into like an alchemical process of what our consciousness is supposed to be doing or figuring out or churning or creating.
Absolutely. And if you even think about it anatomically, the middle portion of the body is always associated with fire, the seat of the fire element in the body, you know, the Agni, the digestive fire, even in terms of like chakras, everything.
Right.
That's where the fire burns in us.
Right. Okay, so we've gone over the general ideas of the 5 elements, and we'll probably leave it here for this particular video. But before we do, we will be looking at, in our next mini discussion, on the 3 aspects of prana. Before we get to that, is there anything else that you would like to share with people who are listening about the elements, things to think about, anything that could help give them deeper insights into these ideas?
I think people should contemplate the elements and not take them at face value, and not take them as merely gross expressions of something. In other words, the elements are not a purely physical reality. What are the elements really? What are they an expression of? That's what we really have to consider, because that essential understanding is going to help us really apply the more advanced concepts of medicine and astrology together.
Would you say, is it easier to think about these elements on a more psychological level than physical level, or is it just on such a spectrum that it covers all, you know, all of that range?
I think it covers the whole range. I think if you start to really consider elements, you'll see it everywhere, at every level.
Okay.
And it's important for people to kind of get into those levels.
Right. So what people could do is start contemplating in their own minds and their own psychology, you know, where do they have solid structures and fixations like earth? Where are they more alive and mobile like water? Where do they have greater sight and heat and light like fire? And start thinking about it in their mind and in their psychology, but also in regards to maybe examining these things in nature, or the structure of their body, or the actual physical things around them. These are the kinds of things that would give them greater insights into the elements.
Exactly. And the healthy versus unhealthy expressions of it and the dynamic balance of it all, that becomes
Okay.
the art of medicine.
Right. Good. Well, that's an excellent point. I think let's conclude there. So when you're thinking about healthy or unhealthy expressions of these elements, and the reason that got my attention is because um, I think the same way about planets, in that you have a healthy and unhealthy expression of them, and
Hmm.
that too often people think that, say, for example, you have a healthy expression of Saturn if or not healthy, you have an emphasis of Saturn in your life if you're depressed or can only see the problems or are stuck on things that you can't change. When in my mind, that's not a healthy expression of Saturn. That is Saturn, but a healthy expression of Saturn would be enduring the difficulties, doing the hard work to achieve greatness. So when you're thinking of these elements for ether or space, in your mind, what would be a positive expression and a negative expression, so people can think about that?
A positive expression of space is simply the connection with the sense of being,
Okay.
the purity of being, and the bliss of that. Unhealthy expression, you see a lot in people who've done way too many psychedelic drugs. It's
Okay.
like that when you just get spaced out, you lose the healthy connection with embodied life.
I see.
Spaced out, just disconnected.
So spaced out is the unhealthy version, whereas the idea of having more clearer, peaceful idea of pure being, which usually probably comes through meditation and mindfulness and things of that nature, that's more of the
Right.
healthy version. Okay.
Exactly.
So what about the wind element then?
Too much wind, one of the common things you'll see is anxiety. People just can't sit still. It's just too much activity. This is unhealthy. Too much activity, too much mind, too many thoughts. The healthy expression is enthusiasm and a sense of vibrancy about life,
Mm-hmm.
which
Like
also
curiosity.
gives rise to joy.
Right. A curious approach versus an anxious approach.
Exactly. Healthy exploration, movement, not getting just stuck and rigid, but
Right.
flexible, moving.
Right. So instead of sitting there and twitching all day long, doing some yoga in the evening.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So space, wind, and now fire.
Healthy expression of fire is discrimination, insight, um, vigor.
And what do you mean by that? Vigor.
I mean, the fire of life is like the circulation of energy, the heat that propels us
Mm-hmm.
in a different way than the movement of wind.
Okay. So whereas we're thinking of wind as an idea of curiosity, kind of like seeking because you're curious rather than because you're anxious, would the fire, would the vigor of fire be more like having the power to actually do something, to move and to do it well?
Yes, and it's also very intense.
Okay.
Fire has a focus and an intensity and an ability to transform things. So
Okay.
the focus and the movement of fire is going to consume that which is before it and transform it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas wind is not looking to transform. It's simply exploring that which may come upon it or that which it may discover.
Right. I see. So fire is more focused, whereas wind is just, oh, that's neat, and oh, that's
Yeah.
neat. Okay.
Fire is what can I take into myself?
Right. Okay. So fire, and then how about water?
Water is the ability to be the healthy expression is someone who is nourished and content in themselves
Hmm.
with the nourishment that they're able to maintain. It's that force that people who are too active burn through very quickly. And because they don't have that density in them, they feel very just unsettled and imbalanced and, unable to really receive anything. They always
Okay.
need to create. They always need to do. So the water element helps us simply be in a different way.
Okay. Your video froze up there for a minute.
Oh,
There you are. Okay. So it's the idea of once you have done with the vigor of fire, the ability to kind of sit back and accept whatever nourishment came from that or whatever growth process is meant to come from that.
that's right. It's the crystallization of nourishment
Okay.
that a person is able to hold on to, and it's like the reservoir of their energy.
Okay.
And when it's unhealthy, then it's being used up too much. You know, there's not enough water element, then a person doesn't have the lubrication with which to receive anything. You know, it becomes chaotic.
Okay. So in a sense, not to belabor the point, but it's sort of like the idea of if you're using your fire and you've done a hard day's work, well, the water element might be the capacity to eat a good meal, rest, and get a good night's sleep so that you can do it again tomorrow, versus someone who they do a hard day's work and they continue to stay up late and they continue doing things. They don't take that time to rest and rejuvenate. That would be more of the rest and rejuvenation would be more of a healthy water element approach.
That's right. Water needs to accumulate.
Right. Okay. And so then finally, the earth element. What is the healthy or unhealthy ideas around the earth element?
Healthy ideas of earth element is groundedness, in the sense of like feet on the ground, and stability. The ability to stand on the earth and accomplish something, you know, with steadfastness. Whereas unhealthy earth element, a person never quite touches the ground. They never quite find themselves fixed with anything, you know. It's like everything goes all the time. Whereas there are certain things that we do need to have fixedness with.
Right.
That's earth element.
It's more like the ability to kind of put down roots into something that's important and stay with it, or to have routine such that life can develop in a healthy fashion around you.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Well, then we'll go ahead and conclude here today with this sort of broad approach and idea of the 5 elements. And the next talk that we'll get into, we'll be discussing the 3 aspects of prana. So again, thank you for being here with me, Neeshee. It was wonderful to talk to you, and we'll do it again very soon. And just to be clear, your website is atmaastrology.com if people want to get in touch with you.
That's right.
Okay, excellent. All right. And also be sure to check the information section below this video to find the sign up for the more lengthy in-depth webinar that we're going to be doing with, I would imagine probably we'll be able to host about 20 to 25 people. So keep that in mind. All right. Thank you very much. And I'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Ryan.